to Eastern Michigan University for the Comics Symposium panel. We're celebrating excellence in comics and cartoon art. They invited us. My name is Richard Rubenfeld. I'm a professor of art history here at Eastern, and this is the second exhibition we've had at Eastern of comic and cartoon art, and our second panel. And I have a very distinguished, they might argue, but I believe very distinguished panel here. And what I would say to you right away is that every one of them is an original. And we prided ourselves in this exhibition of having an exhibition of original art, but the true originals are on this panel. And I would like to introduce them, starting all the way on the right, Dave Coverley. Dave is a syndicated cartoon panelist. His cartoon panel is called Speed Bump. Speed Bump runs during the week in the Detroit Free Press and on Sunday in the Ann Arbor News. And
That's an oxymoron.
What?
Speed Bump runs?
I have feelings that you're very, very disappointed. It's been 24 hours with these folks, so anyway, to his left is Al Feldstein. You've heard him already. Al is literally a legend in the comics field. He's done, let's see, he is a writer, an artist, and an editor. He's probably best known for his work for EC Comics in the early 1950s. Writing, drawing, editing, and then for 29 years served as editor for Mad Magazine. And that's Al Feldstein. And then to his left is Marie Severin. Marie is a veteran cartoonist, rather, as well as colorist. Did a lot of significant work in color for EC Comics, but perhaps nowadays is better known for her work for Marvel Comics. And not only has she colored comics extensively, but she's drawn characters as diverse as the Muppet Babies to the Hulk. Silver Surfer, Spider-Man, Fraggle Rock, it's Marie Severin. And then to my left is Jane Irwin. Jane is an independent comics creator and has gotten a lot of highly deserved attention for her graphic novel Vogelein. And so we welcome Jane. Both Jane and Dave actually have degrees from Eastern Michigan University. I meant to say that. And then on my far left is Len Wein. What my friend Stan says that there are certain things, and I won't even let you say it, certain things in life that are constant.
Death, taxes, and Len.
Well, Len is definitely an original. Len is a writer. He has written a lot of comic books. He writes for television. Some of the characters that he has either created or co-created have included Swamp Thing and Wolverine. He was the editor of Marvel at the time when they relaunched X-Men, which to this day is the most popular of comics. And so, do we have a great panel or what? So I thought the best way to approach this, I would ask a few questions in the beginning, and then I thought maybe the panelists would have questions to ask each other. And although I had some argument about that last night, I've heard lots of questions last night as well as today that they've been sharing some really great information. And then I would like to devote most of the session to having people in the audience, you folks, asking questions to the people up here. We figure we'll end the panel about 20 to 9 and give you folks 15, 20 minutes to actually get up and meet these originals. So does that sound like a good game plan? So I guess we'll start all the way on the right, talking to Dave Coverley. Dave, do you want to tell us a little bit about Speed Bump, how you got into the business of making cartoon panels, just a little bit of history of Speed Bump?
Yeah, I've always sort of done cartoons. I mean, I've probably like a lot of you, I've done cartoons since I was a little kid. And I can't even remember the first time I drew one. It's been so long. But I think what happens, I have a couple of daughters, and one of them's 9. And what happens, I think, is that as you get older, you get self-conscious and stop drawing. So I was one of those kids who never got self-conscious. And I had a family that laughed at everything. So I was always thinking that I was very much more funny than I probably was. And so I had a lot of sort of confidence in it. And so I just drew all the way through school. I mean, I went to Plainville High School, which is in the west side of the state, and then I went to Eastern. I did a cartoon panel called Freens for the Eastern Echo in the mid-'80s. I've always just had a pen in mind that was more geared towards the panel humor, the sort of one joke get the joke out and move on. I have a lot of admiration for people who do the strips, but those are more storytelling, and I'm just not sort of mentally built that way. So I've always had that mindset, and a lot of my background comes from reading magazine cartoons as opposed to newspaper cartoons. So I was a big fan of the New Yorker people and Sergio Aragonés from Mad Magazine, just all sorts of different influences. So I mean, I just sort of followed my dream and got lucky and got a syndicate contract when I was 30. So I spent my whole 20s trying to get one, and much to the chagrin of my family. But it happened when I was 30, so you know, it's one of those plugging away kind of stories.
How long has Speed Bump been running?
Speed Bump got syndicated in '94, so this is its 10th year, and it's with Creator Syndicate, which is out of Los Angeles, and they have DC and Atlanta, things like that. So basically, it's been a slow process. In '94, I got picked up in April of '94, and they needed a panel. They just dropped one, and I had really good fortune because in the fall of '94 is when the Far Side retired, and so I went from being in about 12 papers to being in about 120 in about 3 days. So it's one of those, you know, paper editors, God love them, can be kind of lazy, and so you got a comics page, and you either reformat and put in a new strip, or you just grab another panel and stick it in that same slot. So I got lucky, a bunch of us panelists, Bizarro, a few other guys, got very lucky, and a whole bunch of spaces available, and that was sort of my footing. And then once you get that foundation, you're kind of on your way, you've got momentum. There's a big thing about syndication is getting momentum. The attrition rate for cartoons in the first 3 years is 80%. So once you get syndicated, it's great, but you still have only a 20% chance of sort of sticking around. So it's a crapshoot to get in, it's a crapshoot to stay, and I feel like I just got really lucky.
So you have, I should say that you have a book here that just came out today. You want to tell us a
Yeah,
little bit about that?
book published today, and by coincidence. What are the odds? I'm happy to bring it, so what are the odds? I had a book about 3 years ago that came out, and it was sort of the smaller 8x8. If you look at the comics section in the bookstore, there's just so many books, and so many of them are that little square size, and they get lost. And so I had one of those with Anders McNeil. They got lost, and so I have a new publisher, and the new one is more of the sort of that, I don't know if you've seen the treasuries, sort of 8.5 by 11 or 8 by 10 treasuries. So that just came out today, and it's got some full color stuff in it.
Can we see it?
Oh, yeah. No.
You just happen to have
Severin, I've got it. The old warehouse of that. Looks like that.
So we form a line over here.
Now we'll take the money.
So that'll be in the stores the next couple days.
Al, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got into the profession of comics?
Oh, you know, I was 79 in October, and I don't remember anything.
Next.
I'll wait for the questions.
No,
Tell us a little bit.
Well, okay, when I was a kid, I used to draw comics on my dad's shirt cardboards, little stick figures and tell stories, and I discovered that when you did that, you earned love from your family, because, and so, like any performer, I think we all do this to earn love, don't we?
Sure.
Anyway, when I was in 8th grade in elementary school, my art teacher, who I will always remember and always thank, said to me, "What are you going to do with your life?" And I said, "Duh." And he said, "I want you to go to a special high school in New York City called the High School of Music and Art. And I know you're going to have to travel by subway." I didn't know at the time that it was an hour and a quarter each way. "And I want you to take the test and go." And she sent me to this high school, and it changed my life. And while I was going to high school, I heard about a kid who was making $20 a page doing comic book artwork. And I was setting pins in a bowling alley to make money for dates. And so I said, "Oh, I can do that." I'd never read a comic. I borrowed a couple of comics, I made a portfolio, and I went around, and they laughed me out of every publisher's place. But one guy said, "Why don't you just go to a studio that services the comic book industry and become an apprentice and learn the business. And I said, okay, you know, because I was looking for a job to make money. And I went to a place called Eisner and Iger. Will Eisner was a partner with Jerry Iger. They had a studio. They were doing comic book work for Arnold, which was Quality Comics, and Jumbo, Sheena Queen the Jungle Fiction House. And I started out erasing pages and running errands. And I was sitting there in a studio with some of the greats of the old days, Len Wein and Raphael Ascarita and Bob Webb and Billy Williamson and Mort Webb and Alex Bloom, and I was erasing their pages. Eventually, I was given a chance to do artwork. My first commercial work that I ever did that was published were leopard spots on Sheena's groin, to make a long story short, I met Bill Gaines. Let's see, I went into service, I came back for service, and I went back into Iger's shop because I was waiting to be an art teacher of all things. I was going to be an art teacher. And I was going to go to college under the GI Bill, and I started making more money at Jerry's than starting teacher, so I got stuck in the business. And I met Bill Gaines after I'd been doing teenage comics for Fox, and it's a very long story, and I'm taking too much time. Anyway, the main thing that happened with Bill Gaines was that I convinced him that we should destroy the entire industry by putting horror comics out. And we were the original seducers of the innocent.
And we're eternally grateful.
Thank you.
Marie, I'd like to ask you the same question.
He's all talked out, I can't talk. But,
How did you have your start in comics as well?
well, my brother was in comics. All the fellows came out of World War II and were looking for work and all that stuff, and he went into comics. You know, something going on. But anyway, when I was a kid, I also started drawing all the time because the whole family was artistic. I didn't know that most people couldn't draw. I thought everybody drew. And I wondered why the kids on the block, when there wasn't that many cars in those days, way back in Stone Age, and I would be the one they would elect to do the potsy things, because I would make good squares, and my numbers were good at 6, and I realized, hey, I do get a little favoritism here, you know. And in school, I did all the posters for everybody, or I'd bring them home, and my father would help me, or my brother. And my parents made sure that I had a tremendous ego, because it was swell. Everything I did was wonderful, so I thought that was true. Anyway, my parents wanted to send me to Pratt Institute, and I didn't want to do that. I wanted to earn money for clothes. So I got a job on Wall Street, and then I heard they needed a colorist. My brother said, why don't you try? You might enjoy it. And the reason EC wanted a colorist was that you couldn't have a vampire coming out of the dirt with all his clothes rotting, and the suit was Kelly Green. You know, in those days they had the office boy coloring the comic outfits, you know. And so I did realistic stuff. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the stories and everything. And it spoiled me for any other place I worked, because I always felt I would be appreciated down to the very end, because you guys treat me so good. They also taught me everything that Al was talking about. You've got to be an apprentice. Al and Bill took the time, and Harvey too. I worked directly for Harvey in Manhattan. And all these wonderful minds around you, and they're teaching you all the little things that you need to know in a studio. And teamwork was the essence of EC. Teamwork. And we also kidded around a lot. It was small, you know, and nonsense would last 5 minutes, and nasty cartoons, and ego busting, and all that stuff. And so when Mad was the only thing left. I thought I wouldn't have any work, so I went to work for Stan Lee, because the artists had all left, you know. And my brother was up there, so of course, nepotism and all that business, I went with my brother up to Stan Lee. And then the boom fell in, and I worked for the Federal Reserve Bank. I did a comic book for them on how to write checks. I learned to copy signatures.
How to type checks.
What?
How to type checks.
And, so anyway, then that was getting very boring. They had me doing economics, which I didn't understand, but I did a couple of film strips. So then when I quit there, I went to a film strip place who, they hired me away, as a matter of fact, and I did film strips. And then that was very boring, so I went to Stan Lee, and they never let me out for 30 years. I did everything because I was ready for it. You know, I knew enough about all this nonsense to make them interesting looking drawings, and storytelling came either natural or just my background. When I was little, I loved people to read me everything until I could read. And the information was just there. And like I said, my family treated me as if this is what you should be doing, you know, draw all the time. You have a talent, go ahead and do it. That's fun. So that's it. And I enjoyed my career in comics tremendously. Nothing is ever that easy. There's nasty things that sometimes happen, but that's the thing is, if you like what you're doing, you can't help it. You've got a little bit of talent to do it well, and I've enjoyed it. So,
Very good.
thank you.
Jane, would you like to tell us how you got going?
Sure. I started drawing pretty much from the time I could hold a pencil, and my mom was always trying to keep me busy, and she always gave me art supplies. And as I got older, I was reading a lot of Marvel comics and reading Spider-Man and X-Men and stuff like that. And one day somebody said, "Oh, you like these superheroes, huh? Try this." And they handed me a copy of Watchmen, and it was like this incredible, I was like 14, it was this incredible revelation. And they said, "You should go down to the comic store instead of just buying the stuff that you see in the drugstore." And so I went down to the comic store, Dave's, down on William, the old one, and they said, "Here, try this." And they handed me Mouse, and it was like, pow! I was like 15 years old, and it was like, this is incredible stuff. And still, all through high school and all through college, everybody's like, "Oh, comic books, yeah, right. Like you're gonna be able to make a living doing comic books. Like that's respectable." And so, my mom was always saying, "Don't you think you should have a backup job, honey?" And so, get this, any literature majors here? My mom always said, "Well, what would you think about getting an English major? You could support yourself with that, do your art on the side." Yeah. So I got a double major in literature and art, and what I was intending to do was go into children's book illustration. And brief aside, while I was here, we tried to get a private, like an independent study with the guy here who was the book illustrator. That was the plan, was to learn book illustration. And unfortunately, while we were here, he passed away from cancer. And so we kind of had to, me and my little intrepid band of comic book people that we were all really interested in this stuff, we kind of had to go our separate ways and forge ahead from there. And I wound up majoring in life drawing, where I figured, how can you go wrong? So I took my life drawing degree, and again, still planning on going ahead into children's book, because that's lucrative, right? And so after I started poking around the edges of like the commercial illustration and especially children's book illustration, I found that's a total shark tank in there. It's crazy, like how competitive it is, and like the backbiting and the nepotism, and like who you've got to know to get in there, and I was really intimidating. And so it was a real revelation when I started making my own comics. I sent out, I was trying to do some commercial illustration, and I sent out my comic book to somebody, and I got a rejection letter. And I tell you, I just don't take rejection well. I think that's why I self-publish, because I got that first rejection letter, and it was like, ugh. I was like, I can't take any more of this. I'm self-published. So I did. And the thing that's amazing is like when you try and approach all these big guys in New York City with your little meager portfolio, like you said, you go in and you get laughed at, and they're like, come back when you're actually capable of drawing something. And that's really hard to take. And the amazing thing was when I got my comic book together and started sending it out, just really tentatively and kind of gun shy after I'd been rejected so many times. Everybody was like, "Oh my God, you're making comics, these are fantastic." And the whole comics community has just been so incredibly welcoming. It's just this It's just this absolutely amazing community, and I see a lot of the people from the local community here, and they're incredible people, and they are really, a lot of industries are kind of like crabs in a bucket. As soon as somebody starts to climb up the top, there's a zillion other people waiting to bring them down. And the thing that I found, at least in the independent community, and extending into a lot of the professionals as well, it's the term team comics is bandied about, and a lot of people really believe that philosophy, that the whole negativity thing doesn't help anybody, and everybody shares knowledge, and everybody, when you're down, everybody else gives you the rah-rah speech, and just it's really an incredible place to be right now. So I'm really loving self-publishing. I do a book called Vogelein, and it's primarily getting the biggest reception, not in comic stores, but in public libraries. Public libraries are eating it up, and I found out last week that a teacher in Toronto is doing a unit on my book, and she had me FedEx her about a half dozen copies of these things, so that she had enough to do a unit with, and she gave her students the choice between doing a unit on Buffy and doing a unit on me, and much to my surprise, they picked me. So to me, that I've succeeded. I don't need money. I don't need anything else. It's like teachers are using my book in their class, and that's to me what it's all about. And these guys, it's such an honor for me to be here among these guys. Len he was the editor on Watchmen, and Al was one of the wonderful and thankful corrupters of my youth. Thank God these guys were around to seduce me, because I said to Maria also, it's like, trailblazing, because what I expected to see when I got to comics is like, oh, comics are for girls, because I got that. I was a tomboy, so I didn't care. But I got this for ages, comics are for girls, and then when I got there, I found out all the girls who are in comics, man, you don't mess with them. You don't mess with girls like Colleen Durant, man, she will eat you for lunch. Seriously. And these people, they're such amazing role models. Just get whatever obstacles are in your way. If the comics authority tells you you can't make horror comics, okay, well, we'll just go over here and be subversive and make Mad Magazine. It's just get around the problem and make your art. And that, to me, is something that you don't see very much in this day and age, and it's something that really needs to be celebrated. So.
Very good.
How did you get into comics?
I've been reading them since I was 4 years old. So you go ahead and tell us a little bit about how you got into them.
I actually can't imagine ever doing anything else. I was 7 years old when I got my first batch of comics. I was sick, I was in the hospital. My father brought me a big stack of them, and I was hooked on comics from that moment on. When I was in the 8th grade used to be the magic age of school, I drew a picture of a shark, and my art teacher said, "That's really good, you have artistic talent." And I went, "I do? I'll be a comic book artist." And that was where I went from that point on. I majored in art in high school. I took every art class the school had. I majored in art in college. And in the course of all those years, I became friends with Marv Wolfman and a lot of other folks from which we were all in the same fan club. And Marv and I and several others used to go up to DC Comics on Thursday afternoons. Back when we were kids, there was a Thursday afternoon tour of the office. And at least once or twice a month, we'd skip school and go up to DC and take the tour, to the point where they recognized us, knew who we were. We did our own fanzines when we were in our teens, and at one point Dick Giordano was the editor over at Charlton Comics. We didn't think we were ready for the big leagues, but Charlton was a small publisher, so Marv and I sat down and decided to put together some samples of our work and see if we could get work writing and drawing for Charlton Comics. And my speed hasn't changed. By the time we finished our samples, Dick Giordano was at DC Comics. He had left Charlton entirely. And we went up one day with our samples. We had no education about what to do. They kind of knew who we were, but we didn't make an appointment first. We just showed up at the door with our little portfolios. Here we are, we want to be in the business. And Dick Giordano wasn't in that day. He was home. And we're standing there, Marv and I, very forlorn, kind of looking like Smokey the Bear watching all the forests burn down. and just, you know what? And Carmine Infantino, who was the editorial director at that time, came back from lunch with Joe Orlando and recognized us. "You guys, what are you doing here?" Well, we brought our samples up to show Dick Giordano, but Mr. Giordano wasn't in today, we don't know what to do. We said, well, show them to my boy Joey here, if Joey likes them, you kids are in. And so Joe Orlando took our portfolios and went back to his office, and we sat there for a half hour. He finally came back out and said, you know, I'm not too crazy about the art, which is mostly what I had done, but I kind of like the writing, which is mostly what Marv had done. So if you guys want to submit anything to House of Mystery, which is one of the new anthology books, I'd like to see what you've got. And we ran home, and I said, whatever it takes, and I brought up some story ideas and turned them in the next week, and Joe bought one of them, and I've been a writer ever since. I don't know how I fell into that. I started off that way and ended up over here. But that's how I became a professional. That's how I got into the business.
Well, I have a question that any or all of you can answer, and it has to do with what do you think about the relationship that exists between word and image in the comics media? I mean, so much of what we identify as comics relies upon the connection that exists between the two. Do you feel that one is more important than the other? Do you see something as more of a balance? How would you respond to that? Anybody?
Story is the whole thing. An Adobe story. You're not gonna have a comeback to buy it next month. Story is the whole thing. And to tell a story, you need good artwork, you need good approach to it. And, you know, somebody might say there was a tremendous love of Neil Adams stuff, and people sometimes would buy it just to look at his artwork, but if it wasn't a good story, if he didn't have a good writer, they'll see him on another book sooner or later. But if you don't have a good story to act with, writer?
That was our philosophy at EC. I felt, and I was an artist, and was not a writer at first, but I felt that a good story was the important part. I mean, you can have a great piece of art with a terrible story, and after you've looked at it once, it's finished. They might as well just frame it and hang it up. And so when Bill and when I first started with Bill, I said I'd like to write my own stories. And so I did the westerns and stuff like that. And when I got him to get interested in maybe publishing horror comics, I did the first stories. And he liked my story so much that he said, I'd like you to do all the writing, and I'll fire my writers, the freelance writers we had, which were not very good. Most of the early 50s writers were, you know, there were a few good ones around, like Charlie Byro, but I felt that a good story that it was like a sponge cake, and that the artist would be the icing on the cake, you know. But without the sponge cake, the icing is sweet, but it doesn't have any nutrition.
Is there some reason you pick sponge cake?
I see a gag emerging here.
And the gag's the thing too, you know, if the gag in print is good, and you can even enhance it with a great.
Yeah, it's a cliche, but a great idea can save lousy art, but great art can't save a lousy idea.
That's
So-
right.
And so you really I spend 95% of my time on the ideas, trying to help it get really good, and then the artwork, sometimes I hit it and sometimes I don't, but I think most people really can't tell us. It's more, most of you who draw, I'm sure you're really self-critical. I'm the same way, so I draw it and I think, oh my God, I really ruined that tree. You know, I think people open the paper, they look at it for 6 seconds, they close the paper, it's like, nobody even saw the tree. So, you really overanalyze this stuff.
I love you, writers, we love you.
Well, thank you, Sweetie, I appreciate that. I have sort of mixed feelings about how it all approaches this medium. I mean, it is possible, the story certainly is the thing in terms of the broad sense, but it is possible to do an entire comic book in pantomime with no dialogue, no words, because you asked about the correlation of the words in the pictures, not the story in the pictures.
Okay.
You can tell the story all in pictures and still have a comic book, but if you tell the
It's the
story all in,
idea.
but if you tell the story all in words, you've got a novel. There's a difference. The trick in comics is to find a way to combine the best of both, and which guys
Well,
like
that's
Al
what
have
we
done
tried
for
to
years.
do, although I had a lot of criticism from the artists that they were forced to do hunchback characters peeking out from under the heavy balloons.
Hi, in the tail balloon.
Well, but that was because I got enamored with Ray Bradbury adaptations that I was doing, and he was so inspiring that I started to write bigger and bigger captions. It was an illness.
In many ways, I think the best kind of comic books, at least in contemporary terms, are the ones that they call Marvel style, or attempt to call Marvel style, which is where the writer, at least in my case, I would break a story down page and panel for the artist, with very rough kind of dialogue, telling the artist exactly what I wanted in every panel, and paste the story out. Then after the pencils were drawn, I would go back and I'd do the final dialogue. And you get the best possible combination, because if the artist is told some of that story visually the way he's supposed to, the dialogue and the captions can talk about other things. You don't have to worry about writing protectively. As Superman leaps from the roof, just make sure that the artist is drawing a picture of him leaping from the roof. You can write about other things, and it gives you another dimension to the kind of writing you can do in comics.
I think oftentimes the most important thing is what's left unsaid, and it's the leap that your brain makes between the one and the two, between the words and the pictures. The first thing that you see the picture, and it's almost like while the picture is sitting there on your brain, and your brain is digesting that picture, then you get the additional information, and your brain has to piece it together. It's like the reason why the old radio shows were so evocative, and why War of the Worlds caused thousands of people to flee for New Jersey. It's the images, the extra stuff that when your brain fills in the gaps, when you're not given everything handed to you on a platter, your brain makes all these extra connections that may not even be there. And I think it's that extra bringing stuff to the story. So sometimes it's not even so much what's said as it is what's unsaid, allowing the individual readers to interpret stuff.
Actually, I want to elaborate on that, because there's a real trick to that. Because you've got to know, when you do that, your brain has an idea of what's in between there. But getting to the reader's brain, and how many people are reading this, and they're all different people. So trying to find that sort of common link and a common knowledge that the majority of people are going to see that and think the same way as you. Because it's easy, I'm sure for all of us, the same thing. It's like you start thinking about something, and then your brain goes on tangents, and you don't realize it's going on tangents. And next thing you know, you've got like a toaster cartoon. And you started out with an ape cartoon. And so you think the toaster cartoon makes sense, because your brain went that way. The people open the paper, they didn't start at the ape. So you gotta really think in terms of like somebody objectively who's reading this for the first time.
And another thing people were saying earlier, that it's the story that's the important thing. I would even dissolve that further and say it's simply the idea that is the important thing, because I'm a lot more sensitive than most people I know to bad art in a story. Like, you can have a really great story, and if the art is terrible, I'm not going to want to stick around and finish it. I'm a lot more sensitive to that than other people. Most people say if it's a crummy story, not even the best art in the world. I've got several books that I keep on my shelf. Can't stand the story, but my God, it's amazing artwork on this. But what keeps it on my shelf is the idea that it represents. And I also keep, some stories around that I like, because the idea, even if the actual craft of the story wasn't there enough, it wasn't just a little short of the mark or short of where I wanted it to be, if the overall idea that you're carrying off is there, that's the really important thing.
Okay, the other thing I wanted to ask, and then I'll let you folks do some talking, ask each other questions. I'm very, very interested as an art historian in the process, how art is created beyond the fact that you have to earn a living with your art. Can you tell us, those of you who want to respond to this, a little bit about how you go about, or how you went about making your art? How do ideas come? How do you start? Just a sense of how, maybe the kind of schedule you had.
Pay the rent?
Now, maybe beyond that, the necessities.
But necessity is some of the most driving aspect of these things. I think you can't set aside necessity in a business. We are in a comic business. And more often than not, what drives the idea is, oh God, if I don't get my ass in gear, the artist is gonna be sitting on his hands on Friday. And so you have an obligation to the people with whom you work to attend to their livelihood as well as your own. And that's part of what drives you. I mean, Harlan Ellison used to say he subscribed to a service in somewhere in the Midwest for his ideas. He sends them $100 a month and they send him a box of ideas back. My answer to the question, where do you get your ideas, is always, where don't you get your ideas?
And fear is really a very powerful motivator.
But then when they get the assignment, you start having fun with the challenge of putting it together and polishing it and, moving it around and then hoping your editor doesn't kick some dust.
Notice she looked it out.
Marie was great. Marie was our savior at EC because she alluded to the fact that when our art went down to the engraver, they had these old biddings that used to color things, and we would look at the stuff and, like a green suit on a vampire and stuff like that. And of course, Marie, when she came, was coloring our stuff with great feeling for what we were trying to do. I have, in my retirement years, done recreations of my old colors that were colored by Marie. And I have struggled to do my own thing with the painting, and I can't get away from what she did.
Because I was right.
You were.
No, there's different ways to color some scenes. You can do a vampire at dawn or a vampire at night. Okay, but it's got to be scary. And you do that with your highlights or usually you're dependent solely on the lighting from the artist, and the mood set by the caption or a balloon or.
Yeah, but you were sensitive to that. You were able to pick up the reflected light.
Very talented young lady.
Yeah. We also used to censor our stuff by painting it on the panel entirely blue.
Well,
Because she didn't like that particular panel.
not necessarily on all occasions. Sometimes these guys liked their stories so much, like Davis and Woody, they would put all this wonderful gobbledygook of background. I used to call it Bollywood wallpaper. Beep, 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 and then the two guys are fighting, but in back of them is this marvelous spaceship not doing anything. And sometimes you would lose that if you started coloring lights in all the dials and the costumes on the people fighting. So I would put like a flat tone and maybe lighter tone, but sometimes in the horror books, they would have people's teeth being pulled out and intestines running along the floor. And I mean, I was afraid of losing our company, which eventually did happen. So I would color it so that you could see everything, but it was blue. And no, you didn't have your you have three to make a brown, which is the dirt that the thing is coming at it. And that's red, yellow, and blue. And if it's a dark brown, you've got the intensity of maybe 50% red, 50 yellow, 50 blue. And these are things that gobbled up the artwork. And the printing, remember, was on this atrocious tissue paper. Newsprint. And the colors would fade. The big thing was you would lose some of the black. You could barely read some of it. But I mean, some of this fine stuff, especially like Woody and Davis with all the trees and spaceships and the gore of, all these intestines and everything. So
She was our conscience.
Yeah, well, I try to, tone it down that maybe these mothers or fathers wouldn't pick up the book and say, oh my God. So, anyway, that was, they call it censorship. I was just scared.
I would agree with what Jane said, actually. I think as far as process goes, deadlines are what kill you. And for me, it was before you start doing this for a living, you do it when you're inspired. If you're not inspired, you go back to bed or you have a nap or whatever. And now you don't have that choice. And so you've got to come up with something. There's no saying, well, I just don't feel funny today. So you've got to come up with something. And a lot of times it's just sort of desperation, mistaken for inspiration, panic. Yeah. And you kind of just go down the ladder of your stuff and think, well, this one I guess it's sort of like passable, and I'll draw the best drawing I can do for this one. That some weeks you have it and some weeks you don't, and you gotta turn something in. So, I mean, I look back at the times when I was doing stuff and sending it out freelance, and I thought that's, you know, some of that was my best stuff. That's because I had like a month to do one. So, you know, now I'm doing 7 a week.
You're scratching the inside of your inspiration, your brain, and you tear out the stuff. Sometimes you dig up stuff that I didn't know, hey, that works.
Oh, yeah, that's true too, yeah. You wouldn't have done normally.
Yeah, panic.
I have to admit that my main incentive was to make money.
Well, yes.
It's as simple as that. It was the 50s, we were back in the war. We were having children, we wanted to get a little house in the suburbs, we wanted to pay the rent, whatever. And so I just turned out the best product possible to earn the money so that I could have a good life.
But a lot of people approach their work like that and they turn out junk. You didn't. So, I mean, you start having fun with it. And
Well, I had a conscience too.
a little bit.
Well, freelancing, I don't have as many deadlines. I tend to self-impose deadlines, but I have a lot more freedom because I'm just doing this. I have a day job, so I have a lot more freedom and a lot less free time. I tend to self-impose certain deadlines. Like, one of the tricks that you play on yourself is you inform the catalog when your book is coming out, and then you're like, oh God, now I gotta get it done by such and such a time. But fear still plays a very large part in it because you're sitting at home, and my first book took like 6 years, and it went through a whole bunch of stages and a couple of hiatuses and all this other stuff.
You must be rich.
Anyway. So, anyhow, so the fear factor though is still very present because you're sitting at home in your little studio and you're drawing and you're like, oh God, this is terrible. They're all gonna laugh at me. They're all gonna laugh at me. And so you feel this real obligation to go back and really make sure that you've got a solid story before you go and do all this other stuff. I mean, it's still and another big motivation for me was I was reading a lot of these stories and, you know, telling people around me, I can do better than this. And they were saying, oh yeah, try. And I was like, okay, I will. And part of the thing was there weren't a whole lot of stories out there that I wanted to read. I was reading a lot of retreads. I was reading a lot of, okay, yeah, this is really great, but how many times are we going to see the Fantastic Four's creation story? I mean, it's great to see a fresh new take on it, but honestly, I want something fresh. I want something new. Give me something I haven't seen before, and give me something that isn't just Batman hitting Joker in the face again. You know, give me something that interests me. And it was right at the time that like DC Vertigo's line was coming out, and there was a lot of really intriguing stuff. And you know, back when Al and Marie and Len were first getting their start, there was such a wide range of stuff going on. You had nurse comics and war comics and horror comics. And when I was reading stuff, it's like Watchmen and Mouse, there were these little islands that I saw, and it was Charles Vess's Ballads and Sagas was another real blow to the head. I saw that first when I was a freshman in college. These things that I hadn't seen before, things that weren't, I mean, I love the X-Men, but things that weren't the X-Men, you know. And I really wanted, real inspiration, real drive for me was to create a story that reflected what I wanted to see. So.
Persistence, that's great. And talent, so there you go.
Well, I can't claim much of that, but persistence is, I know so many artists who are so much better than me and who just don't have the stick-to-itiveness, you know, and that's what's really sad is it's like I'm not like Bernie Branson or anybody like that, but it's just stubbornness is a really good trait if you want to be a comic book person. It just really is.
Not gonna hold her down, that's for sure.
Do you have any questions to ask your fellow panelists
Well,
here?
I love the story of Len Wein and Marv Wolfman. I would love you to share that with the audience and your friends when you were fans.
I'm afraid to ask which one.
Well, how you've known him all these years, and you met him through the column.
Hold on.
I just heard it by the fireplace at this guy's house. Tell the story. That's great.
How I met Marv
Julie
Wolfman.
Schwartz.
Julie,
Julie
yes.
Schwartz.
I know what you're going.
And if you want, I'll tell it, but not as good.
That must be fascinating to hear what you have to say. how I met Mark Wolfman. Julia Schwartz's letter columns. One of the differences, I mean, there's an organized comics fandom now, and when I was a budding fan, there really wasn't. There was beginnings of fandom. And I was friends with a guy named Ron Fradkin, who lived in my neighborhood, who's part of our old comics fan club as it evolved. We were looking for other people who were comics fans, and Julia Schwartz, who is one of the guys who helped found science fiction fandom many years earlier, with Moore Weisinger, published the first science fiction fanzine, The Time Traveler, and was Ray Bradbury's first agent and a number of other things before he became iconic in comic books. Was somebody who supported the idea of fans and fandom, and in his letter columns he published addresses along with names of people who wrote in the letter columns. And Ron and I were looking for other comics fans in the area, and in Mystery in Space 75, I think it was, there was this letter from this guy named Marvin Wolfman, who lived not terribly far from us, far enough for kids. I was 11 at the time, so far enough for kids who didn't have much mode of transportation to get anywhere, but close enough that we called up and went, "Hi, we're comics fans, or are you one too?" And I lived at that point in Levittown, Long Island, the cliche of the East, which actually has spawned a bunch of comic book creators. Bob Schreck, the editor of Batman these days, comes from Levittown, and I just blank on his first name, Zippy the Pinhead, Bill Griffith. Bill Griffith comes from Levittown. Michael Gilbert, who did Mr. Monster, comes from Levittown. But Marv lived in Queens, which is about a 20-mile distance from where we were. But by the weirdest coincidence, his sister lived in Levittown, and he was coming out to visit her that weekend. So we arranged to meet at his sister's place. And that's what started. We met, we spent an afternoon together, realized we all shared the same interest. And as we were leaving, and our bikes were parked out in the lawn back in the days when you could put your bike out there and know it would still be there, I turned around to wave goodbye to Marv and say, "We'll see you soon, this was great." And the next thing I knew, they were picking me up off the ground. I had walked into a tree branch and poleaxed myself. And I should have known then that was a sign from God. I didn't take it as well. And that's how we became friends. This is not nearly as interesting a story as you promised.
Well, does anybody else here have questions? We'll get to the
I want to get your questions.
Okay.
Why don't you, Richard, I'll pose it to you since we have a lot of younger fans, since we've heard the phrase seducers of the innocent, could you give a little history on that, please?
Well, during the 1950s, comic books came under fire. Comic books were perceived as seducers of the innocent. They were seen as corrupting. There was a psychiatrist by the name of Frederick Wertham who published a book that was very influential called Seduction of the Innocent, identifying comics, often focusing upon very minute details or focusing upon comics that were certainly not appropriate for children, and it sort of mushroomed into the Keith Hoffer hearings. But essentially what happened as a result of all that was that the comics industry came up with a form of self-censorship called the Comics Code Authority, and that continues in modified form till today.
I'd like to add a little bit.
Sure,
You
you were there.
I want Reader's Digest version. My next question will be before.
It was a very interesting time in our country, almost as interesting as now. Everybody had an agenda. Estes Q. Fowler wanted to be president, and he had run a Senate investigation into organized crime in America back in 1951 in anticipation of the 1952 Democratic Convention, because he wanted to be president. And he had the head of the mafia, Frank Costello, on television, and that was the old black and white 10-inch screens. Nobody had television in those days. But it made a big flap in the news media, and Costello took the fifth like 67 times. I refused to answer that question in the ground. Anyway, so he was looking around in 1955 for the 56th convention, and he sees this, and there's a phenomenon going on in America at the time called juvenile delinquency. kids were questioning their parents and were doing anti-establishment behavior and things like that. And they were looking for a cue. You know, the fact that these kids were doing duck and cover at a siren going off, that they might lose their behinds in a flash, nobody wanted to look at that as being maybe the problem. And maybe comic books like the stuff we were doing were actually kind of like stopgap escape valves for this tension that these kids were under. But in any case, so there was Frederick Wortham, who had treated a lot of incorrigibles and said, I never treated an incorrigible that I hadn't read a comic book. So he made this connection. You know. When I was the editor of Man, one of my first stories was baseball is ruining our children, because, you know, every kid that was incorrigible played baseball. And there was the ones that drank milk. We were going to do the milk thing. Then there was Wortham, there was Kiefer. Then there were the people that just wanted to put their foot in the door as far as censorship was concerned. There was we fight that all the time. And what was the easiest to hit in the indefensible comic books and the comic book publishers that really wouldn't fight hard for censorship. So there was that group. And then there was the comic book publishers themselves who wanted EC out of business because we were giving them a hard time stealing their dimes with better material they were publishing. So the whole thing was one big, terrible time, and Kiefer had his investigation, and Bill Gaines was under the influence of a business manager named Lyle Stewart, who insisted that he demand that he appear before this committee. I was called in private session. I was subpoenaed and called in private session, and I talked to them. They never asked me to appear publicly, but Bill wanted to appear publicly, and we all know what happened. I don't know whether you're aware of this terrible thing that happened, but he made a statement which was, I think, pretty good. It was a good statement. He had a great quote that I loved. He said, trying to explain to someone like Frederick Wortham the fun and the enjoyment of a horror comic was like trying to explain the joy of sex to a frigid old maid. And he said that in the public. And they came down on him. Oh boy. After he was finished with his statement, Kiefer, or the lawyer or whoever was part of this Senate committee that was sitting like we was sitting, and he was down there, said, I have this cover here, Mr. Gaines, of what looks like a beheaded corpse. Someone holding up this head, and do you think this is in good case? You know, and Bill's sitting there, you know, like, when did you stop beating your wife? Yeah, I think it's a good case for a horror comic. And that was the end of it, because you said, well, what do you think would have been in bad taste? And Bill, all he could think of was, well, maybe if the head was lifted and the blood was shed. I mean, he was so terribly hurt by this whole thing that he was identified as some sort of a destroyer of American youth, that he actually gave up all of the horror comics voluntarily. Meantime, our competitors decided to put this code into effect. And why? A lot of them had skeletons in the closet. A lot of comic book publishers at that time had published other things like Spicy Detective and stuff like that. They didn't want that coming out because that was bad. So they had this code, and they outlawed every word we ever had in every one of our titles, so we were out of business. And every subject. Do I get my head chopped off after you finish with that?
If you want.
But is it in good taste?
I'll draw it.
Well, I'd like to hear some questions.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes.
There is just as much going on in government today, as you say, these times now, as there was in the 50s, even if it doesn't all occur on television. I'm not seeing any of the satire that pokes fun. And yet there's so much that should be poked fun at. The changing of the codes, the red alert and blue alert and yellow alert and purple alert and all that other jazz, and all this stuff that's going on that many people feel is nonsense. Is the comic industry silent? Are there comics coming out that do satirize politics, but I don't see them?
I can't answer myself for the comic industry. I know that there are a lot of people that are protesting this kind of trend. We have a lot of great comics on TV that are doing it, like George Carlin. I think Mad is doing it a little bit now. I saw a great page of if Bush was running against Jesus Christ. I know it's really great.
How does one
So
find
there
that
isn't
out?
much of it, though, you're right, and it is because, and I think it's because this is not the same as it was in the fifties. In the fifties, I think was a lot less frightening than it is now, because there wasn't that much blatant,
So it doesn't sell.
what?
Make fun of it.
Well, I don't think that people are ready for the questioning of what's going on.
Do you think in the fifties though, this is more, I think, in the fifties as well as now, you're not seeing so much questioning in the book. I think it's more for the panelists. In the fifties, you would have been called commies, you dared question the UX. Today, you'd be called unpatriotic.
Right.
Dave, do you see this more happening
That's
in the
for more
panelists?
fighting, don't you think?
Very much so. Do you see this as something the panelists are dealing with?
Well, I mean, a few of them a little bit, but when you're on the comics page, you gotta be careful because the majority of people don't read that for a political view. So you see like, when she killed the dog, and it goes haywire. I mean, you can't, kill a voice or something, you have to pursue. I think a lot of political cartoons do great stuff. So, I mean, I think the trend in political cartoons has been sort of to get mushier and less opinionated, but there are some great cartoons out there that are hard hitting. But like, I'm not sure you said this, but those are the ones that aren't getting out there in the mainstream media. So if you pick up like a Time or a Newsweek, you're not gonna see that kind of stuff. You gotta find it in the fringes.
Based on quotes in newspapers.
And that's the point that I wanted to make too, is I think we've got, when you own a smaller company like EC Comics, or when you are in charge of the decisions that you're making, you can say what you want. But right now, you've got most of the media that penetrates 99% of people's households is owned by large corporations. And a lot of times they self-censor what gets out. And so when you've got the three major networks, I want to make sure I'm saying this right, but the three major networks are owned by Westinghouse, GE, and Disney. So when you've got the three non-cable channels delivering that stuff owned by these big corporations and GE, okay, I'm going to go out on a limb here, but two of these three companies are profit from war, indirectly or directly. You got to wonder what kind of interests are going to be represented by stuff like that. And no offense to the people who are working for the big comics companies, but DC is owned by Time Warner, who owns Time, who owns Warner Brothers. And when you've got all this stuff, I'm sorry? Oh, you don't. When you own all this, when you have these big corporate interests, and sometimes they benefit from the way that the news is given to people, that can dictate what you can and can't see. And I think this is the advantage of having self-publishing and the advantage of having people who are putting out their own work, like George Carlin. Nobody's been able to slap a muzzle on George Carlin because he doesn't work for anybody. George Carlin works for George Carlin. You've got somebody like Dennis Miller who's working for, he's taking a paycheck from somebody. He's pretty outrageous, but he can still be reined in. Just look what happened to Howard Stern. Howard Stern he caused a huge fine to Clear Channel, and now he's being yanked off the air. So you do have people who are still willing to put their necks out for it, but the public reprimands that can come from that, like in the case of Clear Channel, it automatically retracts how big your audience is. So that's my little stance. I'm approaching the controversial edge of this, but that's me from being a self-publisher, and that's a large part of why I became a self-publisher. I haven't approached the political stuff, not because I don't want to sell, but because what I've got on my plate right now, I need to finish before I can get on to the next thing. I feel I have very strong political views right now, and I don't know, my current story is not supportive of that at the moment, but that doesn't mean that I won't use a different podium, use a different venue to make that known in the future. We were having dinner with Art Spiegelman, he was here in November, and when we were just sitting around and talking, we were asking him some of his points on political views, and we said, so what are you gonna do if Bush gets reelected? He said, I'll probably leave the country. And we said, where? And he said, well, Francois is an EU citizen, so we've got to pick. But the two, this is the best irony I've heard in ages. He said, well, the cities that I really like are Paris, and if I couldn't live in Paris, I'd move to Berlin. And I thought, how's that for irony? Because the place where he has been when his works were deemed too controversial for the New York Times, the newspaper that picked it up was a German newspaper. And I find that to be deliciously ironic. So.
Any more questions? Ted?
I think earlier you answered your question when you said fear is a good motivator. And I think that is the reason why some people are addressing the problems or the craziness going on, and while some aren't. They want to pay the bills, or if you got a day job, yeah, you can express it, but you got to get out. Personally, I think the adventure's not over yet, and I don't think all of our opinions on what's going on is clear yet. I think, we're all after a time of reflection, but that's what I was, anyway. I'd like to know about your personal highs and lows, maybe your strifes in your life, and how that reflects on your creativity, in your writing or your art, or your just, anybody. Because I personally find a lot of influence on that.
It's like forget your trouble and get happy and sit down and do some work.
There you go, thank you.
I read something by Neil Gaiman, he said exactly that. He said, in times of severe personal trauma, make good art. He said that is the balm for everything. He had this great, it's like, wife run off with milkman, make good art. Lose your job, make good art. Just turn, the fuel that drives artists is emotion, I found. Happiness, sadness, anger, fear. And what you have to do is learn to channel that. Because fuel for inspiration is strong emotion, whatever it happens to be. And the trick, as Dave was saying, the trick is learning to train that. Learning to train that so that it's an everyday thing, as opposed to just, okay, I'm really angry, so I'm gonna make comics, or, I'm really inspired today, so I'm gonna make comics. It's learning to do it daily, or as close to daily as you can make it.
I have to do the opposite, actually. I just have channeling. With my job, it's all humor, so my panel has to be at least theoretically funny. So,
Toughest job in the world.
well, so when my personal life, if something's going on, or if I'm down or whatever, I still got to be funny. So instead of channeling, to make great art, I totally agree. But to be funny, you've got to compartmentalize. So if I'm having a really crappy week or whatever, I've got to set that aside mentally. And sort of like Bill Clinton with the whole run the country, see the intern. So I tend to have to get in a totally different frame of mind when I'm working, and I have to forget my life, because it really does affect you. I see my personal life sneaking into my work as far as subject matter, but not as far as I can't do some dark superhero comic or somebody holding a chopped up head, because I would lose a lot of papers in a hurry. So I've got to be light and funny 7 days a week. So it's a definite challenge with personal life.
Could I ask just a quick question with regards to the mechanics involved in the work that you're doing? Through trial and effort and error, of course, you come to select certain materials that you work with best, with painted medium or with pen and ink and paper. What sort of materials do you find these days that you're working with that you're able to best express your creative interests?
We ask.
Actually, any of you who are in the, sorry, not
I'm
Len, because,
I'm happily retired, and I've gone back to my first love, which was fine art, and I'm painting. I paint scenery, I paint landscapes, western, cowboys, wildlife, and I don't do that out of anger or anything. I'm very satisfied with my life, and I'm having a good time. I live on a ranch in Montana, a ranch that Alfred built, I guess, and I painted acrylics. I discovered that acrylics for me are much better than oil, because I'm very impatient with a painting. I want to start and finish it. I don't want to put it away and let the sky dry for 2 weeks so I can put a tree in front of it, you know. So acrylics dry in 20 minutes, so I can. And I paint on a very fine canvas, and I find that I can capture the light that I love to capture. And if you want to see my paintings, you can go to my website, which is www.alfeldstein.com. Anybody else?
I'd like to hear what, actually, James, I'd like to hear what you use.
Oh, I use acrylic paint, and I thought about doing the whole book in color, and everybody's always like, oh gosh, I would really love to see your book done full color. I would be on about page 3 by now. And it was just too much, and so what I actually just use is a tube of black and a tube of white, and I just mix as I go. So everything's done in black and white paint, but it was taking me upwards of 36 hours per page, and I was painting 11 by 17 pages. It was just taking forever. Every single piece was a finished, rendered painting. And like I said, to complete the art, it took about four solid years of work. And it was just insane. It was completely, I can hear everybody going, oh my God. So it's completely insane amount of work. And frankly, when it goes from being 11 by 17 to 6 by 9, which was the finished size of my, or even smaller actually, it's like 5 by 8, you don't see any of it. So I started making changes in the way that I was working. And first thing I did was move stuff down to 9 by 12. And the second thing I started doing was right at the end of the book, I decided to stop painting so thick. I was painting in a very acrylic style, which is layers of, and mixing while the paint is wet and letting it dry, and then doing washes over the top of it. And I started painting more in like a watercolor style, where you, I always really loved the ink wash drawings of this Italian painter named Tiepolo, who, if anybody here who attended Eastern has ever had the privilege of taking class with John Pappas, he was really into Tiepolo. He was like, oh, showing us slide after slide, and I was really taken by it. And so building up layers of acrylic wash now, and then building in high and low lights. But my most recent addition was I tried inking my lines, as opposed to, I would trace the lines with dark acrylic paint, and I was kind of fighting the medium. Acrylic paint isn't meant to ink with. It's either too thick or too thin, or it's too light or too dark. You just can't get it in there. And so I said, well, why am I doing this? And so I took super fast drying rapidograph ink, which, you know, dries, you can put the line down and run your hand across it and it'll be dry instantly. So I'm inking with that and a little tiny fine brush, and then I'm filling in, almost using the acrylic like an ink wash, and then just popping highs and lows as I need to. And that has sped things up. I've gone from 36 to 48 hours per page, depending on how complex it is, to about 8 to 10 hours a page. And that just in making those few things, and saying, like Dave said, nobody's gonna notice that tree. Just do it, you know, just you know, who cares? So a lot of it is streamlining your process. I said, I like saying that the learning curve on my first book was about 90 degrees. So you get an awful lot after you do it.
Thank you, it's very enlightening.
Oh, thank you.
Over here.
We heard at the beginning what all of your projects are and what you're known for. What's something that you haven't gotten a chance to do yet, or a story or a genre that's kind of near and dear but haven't been able to go that way yet?
I love color, and I always wanted as a kid to do stained glass windows, not holding things, but anything. And I was so impressed when I had the occasion to be in Henson Studios in Muppet, and they have stained glass, and you come in one whole wall of all the characters and stained. Can you imagine? I mean, and then they were in this mansion in the 70s in New York, and you stand in the middle of the reception desk, way up, there's the circles at the top on the roof, and it's Kermit. It's like a church, you know? It's just beautiful, and color to me is it's living. When I used to go to church as a kid, you had every And it was so bad, I used to watch the changing colors as it would creep across the floor. I was so distracted, I thought it was just wonderful. I am, getting back to the, what we use, I have always used Dr. Martin's watercolors. And very versatile because I did such a volume of work in the comic. I'm so used to it, I do everything with that, you know? And it sometimes will limit you, you know, if you're doing a box for a toy company or something, I'd have to go into something else. But I can zip out anything because I've been doing this for 50 years and you color like a maniac. And you have a lot of fun. Color to me is just living, it's just wonderful.
That's a fluid watercolor, right?
Yeah, Dr. Martin's synchromatic watercolor.
Gotcha.
Very expensive,
Top of the line.
but it's fast.
Actually, this is for Len. It follows up on this. Are you using a computer? How has it affected you if you have switched from longhand, working with a typewriter, however you wrote in the past?
Well, I still work in cuneiform. So no, I was telling a story earlier. I switched to a Mac about 18 years ago. I sold my first animated script, and Marv Wolfman and Bob Greenberger and Diane Duane, the science fiction writer, dragged me downstairs to the DC building to the computer store and said, Spence, buying a computer. Because Marv had been saying it will double your writing speed, it'll triple it. And I was going, no, I like the way I work, I control what I'm doing. And they dragged me there and said, Spence, buying a computer. And I stood there and the salesman said, so what sort of computer are you interested in? And I said, you know the term user-friendly? And they said, certainly. I said, I'm looking for one that's idiot-friendly. So I've been working on the Macintosh for the last 18 years. And Marv was right, it absolutely doubled and tripled my speed. I was one of those anal retentive writers. I would write on a typewriter, a Selectric or whatever, but even though I was generally my own editor, or I was, one or two people on earth would see my actual type scripts. Sometimes the artist, sometimes the letterer, sometimes me, and I would still, if I made a spelling error or a typo, I wouldn't fix it. I typed the page all over again, repeatedly, and boy, it got so much quicker when all I had to do was fix the little mistake and not have to worry about it. It absolutely tripled my speed.
What about rewriting and such?
Same thing. I mean, I only have to rewrite the parts that I didn't think worked the first time. So, excuse me, it works much quicker. I don't know how I could ever go back to anything less than that now. But, you know, Harley Ellison, I always talk about Harley, he's one of my best friends, still works in an old Remington manual, because he always says, it gets too easy to rewrite, you get sloppy in your writing. This way you're committed to what you write. And if you know Harley, committed is a good word to use. I like the convenience. I think all of us do. And I don't think it gets sloppy. I think you just get more time. And I think that helps.
Yes?
I was going to say, sitting up and looking at the panels that we have here, we have definitely a split of people who start to learn the craft of comics in a studio environment where you went to work, you worked with other people, there are other people sitting across the desk from you, across the office from you. And then we also have a younger generation of people who are probably a lot more solitary in how you do your artwork. I went to the Marvel comic offices 3 or 4 years ago and noticed that there were more FedEx boxes in the bullpen than there were actual people there. And I was just curious if, from both sides, if you've seen any benefit or loss of the idea of having other creatives around you, or being a little bit more solitary in how your creative process works.
Everybody works different. Years ago, it was a lonely life for the freelancer. They worked at home and drove their wives crazy, or couldn't get a woman that would put up with it.
I have both.
But as I said about working at EC, it was a small group, and in my case, I learned a lot more. But you know, it depends on what you can do. I mean, I can't imagine somebody like you mentioned, Bernie Wrightson, so good, him working in a studio because he's doing all these, you know, the creative thing is not, you know, ours, not that we work I wrote in a studio, but it's a whole different thing. When I did independent stuff, when I did my own drawings, I would work at home. I didn't, I would do sketches for covers, which was okay. I'd get the ideas from the writers or from Xeroxes coming in, do a sketch, and we worked that way for a time. But I mean, the creative process can work in an office, but the real stuff, like what you do, you have to do at home. You have to, and she's independent, that's wonderful. That's a whole different aspect. Nothing wrong with it. We need all of this to create what's going on.
See, I would say just the opposite. I would say, my gosh, if I had only been able to go to a studio and have somebody say, okay, don't make these 10 easy mistakes, or, don't,
Oh, yeah.
you might want to think about painting every single page in a 150-page book. You might want to rethink that, if I had had somebody to just clue me in on some of the process. And I think I really could have also benefited from just seeing not only the process, but the team environment. And that's something that I really wish I could have been exposed to, and I really envy the kind of, where you actually got to see every single part of how it was done. I mean, I just kind of made it up and hoped that it was okay.
Yeah, but now, you wouldn't want to work in a studio because you want to do your own thing. That's what I'm talking about.
Right, right.
You have to have that for your own thingamajiggy.
Well, it's kind of like going to college or going to a trade school. I would have really relished that opportunity.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, I actually prefer the energy. I mean, when I lived in New York and I worked freelance, I would write whatever I got done by about 2 in the afternoon, and I would bring it to the office. I lived close enough; it was a half-hour train ride in. Just for the energy, just to see there and interact with all the people. The energy generated, the feedback were invaluable. I've been a freelancer in California mostly for like the last 12 years, and I work at home, and my company is my dogs. My wife is out for the day, my kid's out for the day. And God, I would give anything to go back to an office environment. I just think you get so much more, everything you do gets better, because you get feedback, even if it's nothing conscious, it's just kinetic energy that you collect as you're involved with other people who do what you do and love what they're doing.
And I love the solitude. I mean, it is necessary if you're gonna do the stuff. But that's one of the reasons why comic book conventions and the community that I described, the Hamtramck community, and there are other communities, pockets around Michigan and around other states. That is so important when you go to a convention and you can see what all the other people are doing and say, because it keeps you honest. I mean, like you said, working in the office environment, you get everybody in, and if you're slacking off and you're looking over here and you're seeing what so-and-so is doing and it's just jaw-dropping, you're like so eager to get back to your board and go, just work for your life, and you're like, oh my gosh, this is what the competition is doing, I've got to go get better. And it's so, you get that in minute increments in an office, and you get it like a sledgehammer to the head when you go to a convention and you get to see all these other people who are so much better than you. And you get to see, it feels like sometimes at the bar, just, especially in comics lately, I mean, it was great, it's been great for years, but just in mainstream and independent media, the bar has just been getting set higher and higher and higher in recent years, and it's amazing stuff, so.
That's back here.
Okay, do any of you have a clue as to how a comic book artist can gain an audience without compromising their creative freedom?
Publish yourself.
Yes,
The internet. If your paper has gone up exponentially in price in the last 10 years, and the internet is an incredible force. Fred Gallagher with Megatokyo, he self-published this for free on the internet and got, a couple of million readers. And now he's...
Do you have any ideas beyond that?
Depends on how much money you want to spend. If you're doing it on a shoestring, doing a webcomic like Monday, Wednesday, Friday, making it regular and keeping on schedule, that's a really fast way to get a really big reader base.
I didn't make money on it, though.
You sell the books. After you publish it for free on the internet, but you can't carry around the internet in your pocket and say, here, I just read this great book. So, well, you can, but it's not as easy. It's not as easy. Yeah. The days are coming when we'll be able to carry the graphic novel on the Dick Tracy wrist TV. If you can get 1 out of 100 readers, if you've got 1 million readers, 500,000 readers, you can get 1 out of 100 readers to drop $15 on a graphic novel, you're doing pretty okay. So.
What a smart guy, gal.
You've been raising your hand for a while here.
And next, because we've been raising his hand for like 30 minutes now, but this is mostly for Jane and David. Since you guys went to Eastern originally, I kind of wanted to know what you guys did in the meantime between doing comics. Like, how did you make a living off of it, exactly? Like, did you have a day job, or what? How did you make it work?
I still don't make a ton. I certainly don't make enough money to support myself on my comic. Not even close. Not even close. I think really, if you're going to make comics for a living, you have to look at it as a lifestyle, especially if you're going to self-publish. It's like I said, there's a lot to Yule. There are a lot of different ways that you can go, but it depends on how much money you want to spend. I mean, if I had $1 zillion, I could self-publish my own works in color with a die-cut holographic cover, and it'd be great, and I'd probably sell a whole lot, but I don't have that kind of money. So you make lifestyle choices. I moved to the less expensive side of the state. I bought a house. Now my rent is a fraction of what it was in Ann Arbor. I work a day job, and I have my studio in my house, so I get done with my day job. Fortunately, I'm working both jobs in my house, so I don't even have to drive back and forth. I don't even have to spend money on gas. So I leave my day, work 8 hours, 8, 9 hours at my day job, go work on my book. That's the way I've done it. I know other people who freelance with their art, who sell other books that way. For me, I am kind of a purist about my art. I really don't like compromising it to anybody else's ideas. I really don't like, okay, I'll put it this way, I'm a control freak. I don't like having anybody else's fingerprints on my work. And so I chose to earn money being a web designer instead of doing Hallmark cards or doing other stuff that would have been a really good venue, being a graphic designer, anything like that. I find that if I work 8 hours giving away my creative energy, I don't have any creative energy left at the end of the day. So I had to pick something that was as close enough to really rote mechanical stuff so that I still had all my creative energy left at the end of the day. So.
I tried to get a job. I had a job for about 8 months, and I got fired. And, I was an art director for a PR firm out of college, and my boss told me, oh, thanks. Jeez.
Great thing happened after I tried to get a job.
You know why I got fired. So my boss had a freelance personality. And actually what I did, I stalled. And I went to graduate school and got a master's in fiction. And so the whole time I was at Indiana University, I was doing cartoons for the Indiana Daily Student. And that's sort of where, after Eastern, when I went to Indiana, that's where I really started taking off with the cartoons, because then the cartoons did a lot better than my fiction did. And I realized that I was just a really terrible writer. I had these really fun ideas for short stories, but I just, I couldn't write more than like half a page, because I'd get my idea out, and I wouldn't be well, all right, I got my idea out. So that's why, for me, cartooning is perfect. And I also have a double degree in philosophy, so as you can see, it's like the least productive degrees. My parents spent about $45,000 so I could do freelance cartoons. So, I mean, it ended up working out, but I stalled until I hit. Got lucky.
Well, first announcement, our t-shirts did arrive. For those interested, you can pick them up at the end of the discussion. And Len, this is a little less serious. We've got some pretty serious questions. Since you've had such a career in well-known companies, as both working on established characters and your own creations, is there any character on both sides of that fence that stand out or that you identify with, that you created, or that was an established character?
Wow. I wish I could identify more Wolverine, frankly. Nice being the toughest guy in the room. I suppose of all of them, Swamp Thing is probably the one I most identify with. I've had people tell me, if I think about it, I was never a healthy kid. I've been sick much of my life, and I always try to keep a very positive, upbeat attitude. People say, that's what the character is. His body's got tremendous problems, but he tries to keep upbeat and positive about the possibility of, I don't know, fertilizing something. I have So I guess that if I had to pick one, it'd probably be him. Although I am the best there is at what I do, and it's not terribly
For
fair.
established characters then, ones you didn't create, since you worked on so many.
Well, the two characters of that were my own creations that I most liked, Marvel was the Hulk, and at DC was Batman. Batman, until what they've done to him the last few years, was always my favorite character. I like the Hulk because the concept of the most powerful creature on the face of the earth with the intellect of a child is fascinating. I'm a big fan of what Peter David did, but when he made him smart, I went, okay, so now you've got Superman without the cool powers. When he's the most powerful creature on earth, and all he wants to do is, pet the ducky. I find that much more interesting than right. And of all the books I ever wrote, in terms of sheer fan satisfaction, the DC Marvel crossover that Garcia Lopez drew, where Batman and the Hulk fought each other, was the most fun I ever had on a single thing.
Batman 1 and
Well, the first one, because he's smart. Second time, the Hulk dropped the building on him.
Can you have a question here?
Well, it's part of a comment and then a question, I guess. For one, it's some of the generational swath in here, because the three youngest all came through as fans first, to cartoon. And Alan Marie came to it more as almost like a job, I guess. Was there a point, I guess this is great, the two of you, that it became more like a job, it became art? Did you reach a point, because EC was, the top of the mountain as far as comics were concerned at that time. And, that was the epitome of art in comics at that time. Did you consciously do that? I mean, was that a conscious transformation, just from going to a job to creating art?
Well, it was a job, but when I had the opportunity to do something with the job, I tried the best to make the product as super as I could. I had a great idea about the fact that most comics looked alike back in the 50s, where everybody was drawing the same way. And artists were coming into the door like Jack Davis with this little kind of strange style, or Graham Engels, who had struggled all of his professional career in comics, attempting to cover his natural style so that he could do sellable art that would be bought by editors. And I said to Bill, when we do these things, we don't let these guys draw in their own handwriting, their own signature. And that was one of the things about EC that I loved, was that each artist had his own style. He wasn't imitating anybody else. And to talk a little bit about the atmosphere of a group, it was a very competitive but friendly atmosphere among the artists, Williamson would see what somebody else did and say, I could do better than that, and so we benefited by this competition. But it was just really a question of striving to do a saleable and, for me personally, acceptable product. I just wanted to do a good job, and I enjoyed it.
I think that's the common denominator with that range in ages, that we all like what we're doing.
Yeah.
And if you're good at it, that's better.
I felt very fortunate that I had a career where for all the years that I worked, I enjoyed what I did. It was good. I feel badly for the comic industry and for the people here who are wannabe comic book artists. That it's not what it used to be. Remember, when I was in the comic business, when I started, there was 600 titles on newsstands, mom and pop stores, and it was a phenomenal time, because of course television wasn't there, and the electronic games that the kids play weren't there. And the only visual entertainment available was either you went to the movies and paid a quarter or a dime or whatever it was, or you bought a comic book and you carried it around with you and read it. That was the visual entertainment. Today, television has become monstrous and feeds all of this entertainment for free, or, in the case of Dish Network, some sort of fees. And I think it's taken away the audience from the comic book. I wouldn't advise, if I had a son who was talented as an artist, I wouldn't advise him to be a comic book artist. I think that the market is so shrinking so fast. I tell them to do Pixar, computer art.
Well, I also think that something that needs to be said here, and this goes for Len and Marie and Al all, it's, I said to Marie when I got here, is you guys are the giants upon whose shoulders I stand. And I can't for 1 second deny the complete importance of their work, because when Al and Marie got started, there were no comic books, as you said. This wasn't, there were comic strips and there were collections of comics from the newspapers, but the genesis of comic books started with you guys. You guys gave, there's so much art that's imitating art now, even with the stuff like Batman. I mean, the Watchmen was really the first superheroes investigating the art of superheroes. And now you've got stuff where people are doing superhero parodies, like The Incredibles, where you've built an entire genre that is big enough and significant enough and identifiable enough that you can make art about it. And I am sitting on the board here, on this panel here, with people who helped create this big identifiable genre. And that to me it's incredible, and I'm so honored to be a part of it. So, yeah. I mean, it's you guys made
You
something
had to
big
go on
enough
from
to...
buggy whips when the buggies were
Yeah.
being replaced by Ford whatever they were.
We probably have time for,
Yeah.
we probably have time for 2 more questions, so. Yes?
Feldstein. That's all right.
Mr. Feldstein, you seem to have a good grasp on the business side. Can you tell us why it is that comics are so much more expensive now and so much harder to produce, it seems?
Well, first of all, the printing processes, paper and everything else has gotten more expensive. And I think that the whole distribution system is a problem in terms of shelf space. What does a retailer put on the shelf that has the most profit? I don't know what the answer is. They made money on mom and pop stores on 10-cent comic books, of which we got, I don't know, 4 cents, and the distributor got 2 cents, and the mom and pop store got a penny and a half for every one they sold. But that's, it's gone. Those days are gone.
Pros were paid peanuts more back then than today, weren't they?
I'm sorry?
Weren't the professionals paid more sub-wages than today?
Well,
And what's the
a
dollar
good
worth
art,
now?
a good piece of artwork would be $20 to $25 or $30 a page. Recently, you've got a cover of mine in this exhibit, a science fiction cover that I did, that I got $35 for, that just sold on Heritage Comics auctions for $18,500. What about businessman?
Good. One last question right over here. Yes?
Yeah, it's from Miss Severin from Marvel. When you started doing Marvel Comics, every comic practically from Marvel Comics always had the setting in New York, unlike Gotham City with Batman and Metropolis and Superman. The question is, what made you pick New York City as
We had the reference. We all lived there. See, now artists can live all over the world and FedEx back and forth. But most artists, for time reasons, we didn't have FedEx and all that stuff. And artists would live, maybe Jersey Jersey, but you couldn't go and live in Montana and get your artwork in. So everybody was a New Yorker. It was the focal point of the comic industry, you know. And like I said, all Ditko had to do was look out the window and he had all those rooftops, you know. When John Romita, it's the funniest thing, when John Romita took over Spider-Man, all of a sudden Spider-Man's uptown. And why was that? He lived in Long Island.
Actually, a quick one, John, why don't you?
All right, real quick, Editor Feldstein had Matt at 2.4 million for issue.
2.8 million.
What?
2.8 million.
2.8, I'm sorry. I'm quoting the circulation figures. In 72 or 3, Marie, this question's really for you. You were behind the helm of Crazy Magazine. How did you feel about going head-to-head with Editor Feldstein at the height of his career?
Like a big cheat. Stan Lee was so glad to hire me when the coloring went out and the comics dropped it at the EC.
I think you learned something with us.
Yeah, so I swiped all my knowledge. No, and they were doing a takeoff on Mad there, and I was supposed to, as I mentioned earlier. But there was no place for me to go, you know, and I'm quite happy being in the industry still. But Stan's office was, the bullpen was huge at that point. He had about 10 or 15 letterers working right there and all, and then that all went down tubes. But what were we talking about?
We're talking about imitating.
Oh, imitating me, I'm sorry. I feel guilty about it, so I canceled that.
You know, I lived through the phenomenon of all the imitations of Mad Magazine, and it always boggled my mind that nobody could figure out what we were doing, and they would do some version of it that had nothing to do with what we were doing, and the same thing went with the horror comics. You know, EC started with 3 horror comics, and we died. We put out of business with 3 horror comics. There was 70 some odd horror titles at one point, and I used to look at them and say, don't they know what we're doing? They're doing horror for horror's sake, and we're telling stories.
But they were funny, and they were so bad, they were funny.
It's so funny that the whole industry collapsed because of the bad publicity. That, you know, if we'd not been imitated at EC, we would have gone on happily doing horror comics and science fiction comics. It was all this imitation. It was the business at the time. It had the negative part, which was the imitation, and everybody all publishers were coming to newsprint were, you know, they were cloak and suitors that could become publishers, and they imitated what was selling. And so they overloaded all the time. Of course, the phenomenon's gone now because of the disappearance of the mom and pop stores and the way distribution has occurred. And I don't know, to answer your question again, I don't know how you can resurrect this dying, shrinking comic industry financially, economically. I don't know whether it's feasible. And not counting the competition of the visual media that is available today.
I think if you saw some of the very rudimentary ground level stuff that's happening with comics right now, I think you'd find a lot of inspiration. I think if you
I've seen some very good stuff, you know, but it's they're in these comics, these stores that are not really mom and pop newsstands anymore, they're comic book stores, and they're like what, $6, $8, or you know, that's a lot of money.
Well, you know, we are fighting
back in the easy days, we got an idea we'll try, because we're not making much money on our sci-fi comics. We'll charge 15 cents. We died. A nickel more, and we died.
The economics of it is, I mean, just to give you a brief idea, single issue, like a 24-page single issue back in the 80s during the black and white explosion when everybody and their brother was posting a black and white comic, you could get like 2,000 copies of a comic for between $400 and $600. And now that exact same comic book will run you about $1,200. And we're talking about a 10 or 12 year difference that the cost of paper, the cost of printing, everything has gone up so exponentially that that's why somebody like me can't afford to do color. That's why I'm still working in black and white. So you have to be, you can work around the margins. The graphic novels that are going to be a big, they're a big change. Mini comics where you're printing stuff just on photocopied paper, and you're spreading that around to get people aware of your product, because you can't afford to advertise, because you can't afford to do all this stuff if you do the internet and if you do mini comics and things like that, and then you bring out your finished product. Because today, when you're getting saturated with stuff, you'll find out that the most important stuff and most breakthrough stuff is all happening through word of mouth. And if you can get people aware by word of mouth, that can sometimes be a lot more effective than taking out an advert or something like that. And what's interesting about this, it doesn't appear from the surface that a lot of this is happening, and when you see the obstacles, when you are the person who's trying to get into that comic store, it's really overwhelming. It's really trying to break into syndication. The odds that are stacked against you are really tough, and so you don't, from the top level, you can't always see all the stuff that's happening under the radar. But when you do go to a comic convention, when you do tap into these communities, and when you do get it on the internet and start looking at the webcomics and the stuff that are happening out there, there's still a lot of vitality there, probably a lot more than you see at the top level.
I profess my ignorance.
Well, no, and I'm trying to give you some more hope, because it's hard to see. You have to, it's like you said earlier, you have to go looking for it. It's not, you can't get it on a
You don't have to
newsstand.
give me the hope, give these young people
Yeah,
that want it.
you can't get it on the newsstand. Go out and look for it, because it is there. It's out there. You just have to find it. So, find it.
We found you.
Yeah, and it's not to say that there's not incredible stuff happening in DC right now, because I've been, DC and Marvel, I've been blown away by the stuff that's been coming out in the last 3 or 4 years. It's the quality level is spiking, and it's really wonderful to see this. I think there's a lot of vitality coming into new titles, and a lot of stuff being tried now that a lot of comic companies, specifically DC and Marvel, and Dark Horse, are saying, you know what, Comics Code Authority, we'll give you these books, but we're going to go over here and do this stuff. We're going to kind of throw off the Comics Code, and we're going to go do some stuff for older people over here. And the edges are finally getting pushed for the first time in a long time, and it's really good to see. So,
Folks, we're out of time, so wanted to give everybody a chance. People want to
We're gonna run, but I hope I'll see you,
Tuesday.